morning, everyone. This is like reunion day. It's really wonderful. It's wonderful to see you all here in this packed house. Thank you all for being here to engage in this dialogue on place and poverty. I'm really happy to be a part of this event, and I really want to thank Barbara Sard and Bob Greenstein on the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities for gathering us all today. I would also like to acknowledge my colleagues at the Macarthur Foundation and our Fellows Program for being so prescient and wise in selecting both Bob Greenstein and Raj Chetty for their genius. This convening has the support of the foundation as part of a grant we made to the center to bring more attention and support to policies that advance affordable rental housing, and in particular to policies that promote housing as a platform for positive outcomes in education, health, and economic opportunity. As many of you know, the Macarthur Foundation has spent more than 15 years across a range of initiatives investing in organizations with the simple goal of improving access to decent, stable, affordable housing for low and moderate income Americans. Our support for organizations engaged in the preservation of affordable rental housing have created important policy and financing innovations that have made it easier for developers to preserve rental housing as well as build more housing. Our support for research on how housing matters is also helping to shift the dialogue that what we do in housing is not just housing for shelter's sake. If it is done well, housing policy can positively shape health and well-being, educational achievement, and overall life trajectories for the families and individuals we help house. With the increasing recognition of growing inequality and stagnant upward mobility, the Foundation thinks it is important to more explicitly address the ways in which place-based policies and housing policies in particular may both contribute to or be a way to resolve vast inequalities and stagnant economic mobility. And because of the research by many gathered in this room, we know more today that housing and place matter. Their work is transforming and injecting new energy and life into conversations about place, housing, and economic mobility. The good news is we also have a cadre of nonprofit government housing providers, community developers, and experts who have been thinking about this for years and who have a treasure trove of ideas about how to use housing as a lever to promote economic mobility. Unfortunately, for too long, conversations about housing and community development have occurred on a separate track from dialogue about poverty and opportunity. Our job and goal for today is to bring these tracks together, to connect folks who work to improve upward mobility with those folks who work to provide affordable housing and improve neighborhoods. The Macarthur Foundation's goal at this stage of our housing initiatives is to ensure that the research and evidence-based practices are part of and driving conversations about how to improve housing policy, as well as its alignment and integration with other social and economic policy aims. We intend for the great work and capacity in the affordable housing and community development sector to be further leveraged and achieve broader social goals. To move the field forward, we want housers to better understand how they can support the missions of educators, healthcare providers, job trainers, et cetera. And it is also essential that the people who work on poverty, on education, and on health understand the value of a decent, stable, affordable home, and to consider it as core to realizing your own missions. The very same people we work to house better, more stably, and more affordably are those that you work to educate, care for, and lift up. Finally, it is important to note that how we provide housing, where we do it, and with what intention also matters. For many years, the Macarthur Foundation has invested both in efforts that preserve affordable rental housing in areas of opportunity, but also in areas that preserving housing in areas where community investment is needed. Neither are easy, but we believe firmly in a both-and approach. And I think Dr. Chetty and his colleagues' works both point to both. Excuse me. We are pleased to see today's agenda shaped in a way that considers and tackles investments around housing mobility as well as in underinvested areas. To direct resources to one strategy or another ignores the complexity of the challenges facing Americans struggling to make ends meet and to make a better life for themselves and their children. We feel strongly that to improve economic security and enhance upward mobility, particularly in this environment of scarce resources, we need to better align and integrate systems and supports across housing, economic development, income supports, education, health, and healthcare. We cannot afford to have housing policy and community development practice remain separate and apart from these other policies and programs. For this, we are grateful to Barbara and her team for bringing you here to help identify how we can make this happen and for hosting this very important discussion. Thanks very much, Barbara.
Thank you, Jana, for your kind words, your partnership, vision, and guidance to me for many years, and to so many others of you in the room involved in housing policy, and of course to the Macarthur Foundation for enabling the center to put on this exciting conference. And thanks to all of you for making the time to participate in what promises to be a stimulating and productive day. You are a remarkably talented and knowledgeable group. I'm looking forward to learning from you as well as our outstanding speakers. There is a list of attendees in the folder. You can see who's in the room with you, and the bios of speakers are printed in the program along with the complete agenda, so we will not be taking the time for introductions of most of our speakers. We're filming these sessions. The videos will be available on our website in the coming weeks. We will break several times throughout the day with snacks. There's going to be a facilitated discussion at lunch to help gather your reactions to the events of the morning. There's a page in your folder about the questions in case you care to take notes. If you're like me and you forget thoughts and they go out of your head, you can take notes. And to enable these discussions to benefit from the diversity of perspectives in the room, we've taken the liberty of assigning everyone to a seat. Now, I think that everybody hasn't followed the rules, so if you need a seat now, just take an empty one, but please do take your assigned seat for lunch. And after that, you're free to move around. You're welcome to tweet. The hashtag is whatever that is, poverty in place. You can tell my experience with tweeting. It's on the program cover. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping rules. Please take out your cell phone and turn off the ringer. The Wi-Fi instructions are located on the inside left flap of the folder. Bathrooms are immediately outside the ballroom. If there are lines, there are also a couple of bathrooms upstairs. And now it is my great pleasure to hand the program over to the president of the Center on Budget, Bob Greenstein, one of the nation's foremost experts on poverty. And in a slight change of the agenda, Bob will introduce the Honorable Shaun Donovan from the chair, and they will engage in a dialogue for about 15 minutes, and then there will be time for questions and answers from the audience. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. It's my great honor to introduce Shaun Donovan, who really doesn't need an introduction. He's the director of the Office of Management and Budget. He's the former secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. He's the former commissioner of the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. And he has really devoted his life to public service in these areas. I just want to make two more comments. About a year ago today, it was very close to a year ago today, I was at a policy retreat in New York. And the highlight of the retreat was at about 10 in the morning, Raj Chetty got up and gave a presentation of his forthcoming research on moving to opportunity. The audience was riveted. Upon its conclusion, people began to ask, what are the policy implications of this research? And another participant in the retreat was the first to begin to explain to others at the retreat some of the practical policy implications, and that was Shaun Donovan. I don't know if you all realize we are right now in the middle of what at OMB is called Director's Review, where the OMB director reviews presentations on the budget for every part of the budget. It is one of the busiest and most intense parts of the year for the OMB director. OMB directors don't do outside speaking engagements generally during director's review. But I think as a signal of Shaun's deep interest in these issues, he has somehow made time to be here with us this morning. So please welcome Shaun Donovan. So Shaun and I are going to have a conversation about these issues, and then hopefully we will have time for a few of your questions. Shaun, as you know, this conference is designed to provide a forum for discussing how we should think about persistent poverty, mobility, place, particularly in light of the new research and the data. You've been thinking about grappling with these issues for years. Can you share some of your current thinking with us?
Absolutely, and it's moving to me to talk about this in front of so many friends and colleagues who have worked on these issues over the years. But I was thinking, my very first introduction to these issues was, in an academic way in any case, was in Bill Apgar's housing policy class at the Kennedy School. And one of the very first papers that we wrote for that class was on the Gautreaux housing experiment. How many people know the Gautreaux housing experiment? There you go. How many rooms could you ask that question and see so many hands? It's a nerd fest here. It's great. So literally from the beginning of my engagement on this work, I think so many of us have had this kind of feeling in our guts that if we can attack the intersection of poverty and place, that we really can make people's lives better, but we really couldn't find that much of it in the data. And I think what is really exciting, and I compliment you, Bob, and the center for bringing this group together at this time, what is so exciting about this moment is that we finally are starting to see, because of advances in technology and research, because of the persistence of so many people in this room, very hard evidence, not only that this work has impact, but it has impact that is enormously meaningful. If I had been a student in Bill Apgar's housing policy class and be able to see Raj's work concluding that the difference between growing up in Baltimore or 50 miles away in Fairfax County was going to be a third increase in your earnings, particularly for young men, that is unbelievably powerful. If I'd been able to see that getting a housing voucher and moving to a higher opportunity neighborhood would have roughly the same third increase in my earnings over my life, that's very different from what the Gautreaux experiment showed us and that research. And so for me, the idea that after decades of really hoping for, kind of believing in our guts that this work would make these kind of differences, we are actually seeing that with real research over long periods of time with deep impacts on the families and the places that we care about. And I think it's exciting because that's happening not only just around place, but I think as also, Bob, I think the center has done very good work to show that many of the efforts, the broader safety net programs that aren't as connected to place, also are having very long-term impacts where not only are they helping to relieve immediate deprivations of poverty, but also able to create the conditions for longer-term success of those families, particularly the kids in those families as well. And I think that what that means is that we gather at a moment of what I hope will be, as we all look back maybe in 20 years, a turning point in this work, and the attention, the resources, the focus on this connection between poverty and place.
So building on that, can you talk a little bit about what are some of the policy conclusions you draw from this research?
Well, pretty simple, I think, and I would say there are three of them. One is that when designed in the right way, safety net programs can have not only immediate but very long-term impacts that improve the life chances of children and families, and I think that that's very powerful. But also that we can no longer accept that the zip code where a child grows up should determine their life chances. And I think that means really there are two parts to that. One is that we have to do more to give families access to neighborhoods of opportunity. And second, and whether there's been lots of debate about this, people versus place, whatever you believe about the various efficacy of both of those, I think it's a real fact that we're not going to move every poor person out of poor neighborhoods or concentrated poverty neighborhoods in this country. We have to do more to actually create opportunity in those neighborhoods that don't have it today. So it's both the people and the place focus that we need to be focused on.
So I want to dig a little more into each of those, the mobility and the place, but just before we do, you oversee the whole federal budget. The federal government has various programs to try to boost the incomes of low-income families, to try to incentivize and supplement the earnings of low-income families. What role do broader strategies, income-related in particular, play in these larger questions of economic mobility, whether you move geographically or you're remaining in a high-poverty community?
So I think, and I give a lot of credit to Jason Furman and others in the administration who've really, I think, looked at this well as many people in the room here. But I think we do have more and more evidence that when we look at poverty in the right way, and I think that's particularly with the broader poverty measures that we have, we've seen roughly 40% decrease in poverty over the decades since the War on Poverty came into existence. And I think we do have increasing evidence, despite Charles Murray and other past claims that we don't, or even that the opposite, that these programs have exacerbated poverty. I think we have increasing evidence that we have moved the needle on poverty. I also think in a more immediate sense that if you look at the response of the Recovery Act, I think we have pretty good evidence that had we not moved in the broad set of ways that we had in the Recovery Act, we would have had more than 5 million more people who would have fallen into poverty just in a year after the Great Recession. So that is, I think, quite powerful evidence that in the short run, we can move the needle on poverty as well. The thing that I think is exciting, though, as I mentioned earlier, is that more and more we're seeing the long-term impacts of some of these interventions. And I think, in particular, our efforts in the administration have focused in three broad areas. First, in education. I think particularly in early childhood, we have very good evidence that well-targeted, well-designed interventions in early childhood do make very powerful differences in the long run. That's what has led the president to significantly expand proposed investments in full day, full year, Head Start, for example, very, very broad proposals on early learning more broadly. It also obviously has led to a big focus on expanding outcomes in pre-K, K through 12, and also on college access and affordability. We have very good evidence now of the link between educational attainment and earnings, and we have to do more to make the college experience both accessible on cost and a quality outcome. So I think that educational piece is critically important. In terms of work, I think we know both around well-designed job training, but also in particular the effects of the Earned Income Tax Credit. You all have done great work on this. What we did in the Recovery Act, the expansion there, even the bipartisan support for the childless EITC, I think all of that is based on a strong body of evidence that the long-term impacts there are quite powerful. And then third, I think there are a number of places where we have focused on particular populations that are at highest risk of long-term cycles of poverty, whether that's in criminal justice, in homelessness, in a range of other areas. And I think what we're finding more and more with that evidence, although I think there is much more that we can do there, that well-targeted interventions can break those cycles, have a high chance of breaking those cycles, with both very important implications for the life chances of those folks that may be sleeping on our streets or in our institutions like prisons, but also that the cost savings that we can reap from well-targeted investments are substantial over the life of those programs. And I think that is one of the things that's helping to build some real bipartisan support around these targeted efforts. So those are, I think, three broad areas and a few particular examples where we've been most focused at administration in driving that policy forward.
I'm just going to say, for people in the room who haven't had the opportunity to be in a room and hear Shaun Donovan before, you are hearing how deeply knowledgeable the Director of the Office of Management and Budget is on many aspects of poverty issues. This is not an answer. I think I've known a lot of OMB directors, been terrific OMB directors. That is not an answer that your typical OMB director could have given. Shaun, let's turn to administration policies. And I want to, as I said, dig in a little bit more to mobility and then place. So can you talk a little bit about what the administration is doing or can do to help more people move from high poverty to low poverty neighborhoods?
Well, obviously, there are a set of key levers there, and the one I've obviously spent more time on is the housing lever. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the transportation levers, the education and sort of school assignment levers as well. But just to focus on the housing piece for a second, and again, to go back to Raj's work, the power of the housing voucher and connecting housing vouchers to the right set of policies, I think we now have conclusive evidence can be a very powerful tool. And I think in particular, and this is one of the things I mentioned at the retreat you talked about last year, and I give Barbara a lot of credit for the early work on this, even what are relatively simple changes about the way that we administer those programs can have a powerful influence. An example is the way that we allow people to use vouchers. The rent limits are set through, as most people in this room know, through FMRs. I always remember the first time I heard that, somebody said, it's like the Holy Roman Empire. They aren't fair and they aren't market. The Holy Roman Empire wasn't holy, wasn't Roman, right? So, but just on that, where we've started to experiment with certain geographical areas in Texas and a few other places, where we allow the rents to vary by zip code rather than by a metropolitan area, what we've seen is a pretty powerful, at least early effect, that families actually do have access to higher opportunity neighborhoods and are using those vouchers in moves that in ways that we think are pretty powerful. So that's a good example of shaping a program that already can have powerful effects to really make sure it is the most effective in accessing high opportunity neighborhoods. There's a range of other ways where we should be making sure that federal investments are promoting opportunities in high opportunity communities. For example, the affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation that came out this summer, the final version, I think is a very powerful framework that, if implemented well by local communities, could really help to shape driving affordable housing and other investments into higher opportunity communities. And then I think we have a range of other ways that we can do this in other policy areas. And so one of the things that I think the Transportation Department is doing well, I give Anthony Fox a lot of credit, is making sure that as we're making investments like Tiger grants or a range of other things that really do potentially create more access to jobs and opportunity, that we are doing the planning necessary to ensure that high poverty neighborhoods are connected to neighborhoods of opportunity, and that we're thinking about, and I'm not gonna, we just had this discussion in one of our director's reviews yesterday, I'm not gonna leak anything that might be in the budget this year, but we are looking at ways on the school side to try to really move forward with ensuring that all kids can have access to higher opportunity schools as well.
So that leads into the parallel question. Could you talk a bit about the administration's strategy for those people, probably the substantial majority of people who live in very poor areas who aren't going to have the opportunity to move to a higher opportunity area?
Yep. And actually, there's one thing I forgot, which I think is an important piece of the prior question. And I think it's one for all of us to really think about and grapple with. So much of the control of these issues is really at the local level. The barriers, so many of the barriers are really around land use, around housing costs that come from building codes, all kinds of regulatory kind of structures that the federal government, at least directly, has very little ability to control. And I think one of the challenges for all of us that care about these issues is, and we were actually just having this conversation with the president last week, what are the levers that we have at the federal level, but also how can you all, as advocates around this, really drive a set of changes at the state and local level that in the end, to be frank, are going to be much more powerful. Zoning is a good example. I'm a big believer that inclusionary zoning, other changes in zoning policy can be some of the most powerful tools to get at creating opportunity for living in higher opportunity neighborhoods. But how we can move the needle on those is a real challenge. And we did put in our budget last year a $300 million fund that would incentivize these kind of behaviors, but it's going to take a lot more than that, I think, and even getting it enacted would be a big deal. But I think it's going to take a lot more than that and a big push at state and local levels to get that done. To go to your question about the communities of highest poverty and what we can do there, I think we are seeing exciting results that, whether it was the Harlem Children's Zone in New York that I worked very closely with when I was there, or a broader set of communities where you are starting to see encouraging results on turnaround strategies for those schools, for particular housing developments through choice neighborhoods, or more broadly on a neighborhood level, I think I would still characterize those as generally, we know it when we see it, that it works. I don't think we yet have a kind of playbook that allows us to say consistently, here's exactly what it looks like to be able to achieve that. And I think the challenge for us is to take early examples of success and really be able to achieve those at much bigger scale. And so a lot of the work that we've done through Promise Zones, Choice Neighborhoods, and Promise Neighborhoods, other efforts that I would really go to, efforts like Strike Force at the Department of Agriculture. They've been able to move $1 billion of increased funding in the Department of Agriculture into high poverty communities over a very short time through their Strike Force initiative. And I think what we're seeing is that you need to get to a combination of increased investment in those communities, but also you need structures that build the capacity of those communities as well. And that means, that's exactly what our Strong Cities, Strong Communities effort, for example, was based on, is how do we bring more capacity, build more capacity in communities? Because often bringing the resources isn't going to lead to longer term success if you don't build the capacity of local institutions, local government, to be successful over a long period of time. And that's really sort of these twin challenges of capacity and resources, I think, are what has bedeviled many of these communities for decades.
In addition to your interest in local government, where you've had extensive experience, you've been particularly interested too in breaking down silos between different programs and agencies. How does that fit into these issues and these strategies?
Well, for any of us that have worked at the local level, it drives you nuts when you see 4 or 5 different federal agencies that have these great plans and they never talk to each other, right? And so you can be creating a new high-quality school in a location that may be completely disconnected from the way the transportation department is thinking about the transportation system. And I've literally examples in Fresno, California, a major high-speed rail investment that's going to completely miss the downtown area that is the #1 priority for revitalization of that mayor. And the good news there is that by working with local communities and trying to bring together a range of federal agencies to work together in more collaboratively, you actually, with no more money and often actually saving money, can actually coordinate these investments and the work in a way that I think leads to substantially better outcomes. We saw this in our work on Sandy. I think I see Laurel Blatchford here, who led that effort. We all know that when a disaster strikes a community, the people who are most vulnerable before the storm or before the disaster end up suffering the most from that disaster. And so having a coordinated strategy where the federal government can work in partnership in those communities can lead to substantially better results. And so one of the things that we've done, we've set up a community solutions team at OMB, led by Tara McGinnis, who's here. And for the first time, what we're trying to do is institutionalize practices that really get different government agencies to work together effectively. And so just to give you a few examples, we're one of the largest landlords in the country, in the federal government. And yet we don't think strategically often about the way we locate our employees, how we use our real estate complements or actually contradicts local strategies on place. Fresno, again, I'll go back to the example, revitalizing this downtown core, which was the highest poverty community, the center of homelessness in Fresno. The biggest challenge the mayor said they had was a particular building that had been vacant for a couple decades. It turned out that GSA was looking for a space to relocate a federal agency in that community. We connected them with the building owner, and lo and behold, within a couple of years, that building was renovated, occupied, and had a new source of economic development for that community. So what we're trying to do is, like that's a simple example, but set up structures that allow us to make sure that whatever strategies we have on poverty in place are complemented by the full set of resources that the federal government has that can make a real difference in moving those communities forward.
So we're going to be talking more about Ross Chetty's work, and as you mentioned, going even back to Gautreaux, there's a lot of research on the impacts of certain kinds of mobility strategies. One of the things that frustrates us all is the lack of a comparable body of research on what works on the place-based front in the highly impoverished communities. Could you talk a little about that and about what steps you think can be taken to increase the knowledge base there?
Well, one thing we have to do is just invest more in research and evidence. And the truth is that, it's not the sexiest thing for all of us to be able to go up to the Hill and argue for often, particularly when you're looking at, as we have been through sequestration, significant cuts or restraints on the very programs that we want to be measuring the evidence for. And so those are tough choices that I don't want to underplay. But I think there are a range of kind of strategies that we can use that are powerful here. First of all, This is something that we did at HUD and had some success with early on. Where can we have set-asides within programs where we say, flexibility that a percentage of any program investments can be used for demonstrations, research, evidence? What are the no-cost or low-cost ways that we can make administrative data available? Raj's work is a very good example of the power of that administrative data. And I've spent a lot of time with my team at OMB. We have an evidence team that's doing very good work on this. You would not believe the restrictions that we have across the federal government just in terms of sharing data between pieces of agencies. Forget about across agencies. We were just talking about federal student loan data, Social Security data, a broad range of things that are very hard even to share amongst components of agencies, much less across agencies or with the public. And so we have a concerted effort. Every single director's review, actually, that we're doing, the full 24 of them over these 3 weeks, every single one, we have an evidence paper where we're looking at what increased investments should we be making, what data should we be unlocking, and the vast majority of those are very low cost or no cost investments that I think are very, very important to make.
Final question. You played a central role in helping to bring about the just enacted budget deal, which, looking at the political polarization and the gridlock for many of us, it significantly exceeded what we thought was possible.
You and me both.
So, looking forward, the issues of mobility and high poverty are not new. Some of the research is new, Raj's research in particular, but the issues have been with us a long time, and we do have this difficult political atmosphere. What do you see as the prospects for achieving some really significant progress in the years ahead in these areas?
So, look, I don't want to be Pollyannish. There are very difficult and strong political divides around many of these issues. And I think we're all, or many of us, concerned with the risks that we have today to a broad range of these investments that are critical, that you'll all be talking about and that we have increasing evidence for. On the other hand, what I would say is that as we build really strong evidence around a set of these programs, and in particular show that the outcomes not only can improve people's lives, but lower costs for government over the long term, I do think, and we see rays of hope around childless EITC or criminal justice in a range of areas. Homelessness is an example within housing where I think this has been true, that there is growing bipartisan support. I do think that there are real prospects for making progress here. And I think, if you look at this as not just a moral issue, but think about the $500 billion a year that we lose from kids growing up in poverty in this country, the lost potential that means in terms of, whether you talk about it in competing against other countries around the world that are investing in their kids. How are we going to compete internationally if we're leaving behind 20% of our kids, not living up to their full potential? If you look at, as we know more and more about the costs on health, on prisons, on institutions more broadly, there's many different ways that you can cut this and come at it. But the more that this group can bring evidence forward that shows over the very long term that those costs, that the cost of doing nothing is enormous, I think the greater chance we have of making progress here. And I'll go back to where I started. If the students today taking a housing policy class, whether it's the Kennedy School or anywhere else, can look at Raj's work and say, no, it's a fact that if we do this, that the outcomes will be substantially better. It isn't a slam dunk. It doesn't necessarily lead to, Congress turning on a dime, but over the longer term, I think that really does make a difference in the fight that we've all been waging for a few decades. So that's why I came today in the middle of directors' reviews. It's, you can hear in my voice, I've been a little sick, and I'm burning the candle a little bit at both ends, given the budget deal and directors' reviews. But it is why the work that you all are doing in this room, I believe, can make a very powerful difference in the coming years for these critical investments.
Needless to say, we wouldn't be holding the conference and all these people wouldn't have come today in a rainy day if we didn't all feel that we could make progress, and we hope this conference in some modest way will contribute to that. Do we have, I know we're running out of time. Do we have time for one or two? We have very little time, just maybe 2 questions.
The mics are at the sides. One in the back and one over here. Where the hand delivery.
Hi, Jonathan Horowitz, Low Income Investment Fund. Good to see you. You're always
Good to see you.
Always Mr. Secretary to me. You may remember it was about 6 years ago that you and I and a small team of us went for our own director's review of the FY09 HUD budget. And I don't know what the statute of limitations on the OMB process is, but let's just say we were a little aggressive in trying to realize savings from the investments in support of housing. And it's exciting to hear what's happening in this budget. And my question is about, you were talking about the long-term prospects for increased investment, because we are in a time of having more evidence than we ever had at the end of the last Democratic administration for how these investments work, and yet because of the fiscal constraints, we don't have a lot of incremental vouchers, other things like that. So we're in a long-term game. There are a whole set of initiatives around building evidence. Pay for Success is just one tiny piece. And my question to you is, how are you feeling? You're obviously a little sick because usually you are eternally optimistic and kind of a Pollyanna, which is great. How do you feel about those initiatives with Speaker Ryan coming in, surviving within the budget process? Because we've all seen, unfortunately, that some initiatives that have bipartisan support, if they're identified with the administration, become chits. So I'm just wondering how you feel right now about the evidence-based pieces that are scattered throughout the budget.
So first of all, I think we should recognize that lots of this work can be done without legislative change. So there's a huge amount that agencies are doing in creating evidence teams, appointing chief data officers, making changes to systems, linking systems together. And so I don't think this is an all or nothing question around what Congress does. And I do think, Pay for Success is a good example. We've been successful in getting Pay for Success embedded in a range of agencies. We're actually, Marilyn's here. Did we just about to release the next set of youth partnerships? I think we they're out, right? So we are making progress there. And we do have bipartisan legislation, I think both in the House and the Senate, on Pay for Success more broadly. So I think we have a real shot at that. So I think we are making some progress there. I think one of the things we shouldn't forget as well is that health is a critical part of this. And if you look at what's happened, despite all the yelling and screaming about the Affordable Care Act, our ability through the Innovation Center for Medicaid and Medicare, the huge investments in health centers and in a range of other areas, I do think that there is an infrastructure of evidence-based policy that is very, very different from where it was when the president came into office, and that is institutionalized in a way that we're not going back. I think a lot of what will happen, because of the importance of the administrative side of this, the executive authority, is depending on who the next president is and what interest they have in this. I think that's a huge determinant. But I do think that there is a growing bipartisan opportunity here that I'm generally optimistic around in the long term.
So we have time only for one last question. Brief question.
Hi, my name is Dr. Megan Sandel. I'm a pediatrician at Boston Medical Center, and so I loved what you just said around health, because for many of my patients, 3 out of 4 of them are sitting on waiting lists to get this. And so though I really appreciate the emphasis on more research, in many ways we know that the brain you're going to grow for the rest of your life is in the critical window of young childhood. Roz Chetty's work focused on the fact that younger kids did better when they moved to better opportunity neighborhoods. So I wondered if you could talk about more of the opportunities in which health, because when you look at what's choking the budget, both on the federal and on the state level, it is the health costs. And so when I think about housing, I often call housing a vaccine. It's going to keep you healthy now and in the future. Are there ways in which we can, because health will want the evidence base, but can we look at the evidence base as a half full instead of a half empty approach to try and drive this, not only on the individual level, potentially with vouchers, but are there ways in which we can have healthcare institutions invest more in neighborhoods in order to make that a stronger investment? So we're not waiting, we're actually investing now, because we're going to miss a generation of kids otherwise.
Yeah, so first of all, I do think, and this partly goes to Jonathan's question earlier too, if you look at what's happened to housing vouchers over a period where many, many things in our budget have been squeezed in real terms, have declined in real terms because of sequestration, we've continued, the fact that the number of voucher holders is actually up across the country is, I think, one piece of the fact that there is a lot of evidence for vouchers as a powerful tool. And the other thing I would say that, it chafes me as the budget director that we don't talk about it enough. The long-run costs of healthcare for the federal government are down dramatically. Just in the year 2020, we expect to spend over $200 billion less on Medicare and Medicaid than we thought we would 5 years ago. And so we are bending the cost curve. The president came in and said, this is the most important thing we can do on the budget. And we are doing that. And that is unlocking the ability for us to do many, many things in the health space. And I think that is, health centers is a good example, but there are many others as well, the extension of CHIP, et cetera. We do have, I think, we're yielding benefits already, given the work that we're doing on that front to be able to invest. And the Affordable Care Act itself, the requirements of it for many services that are available, preventive services, the locational through changes in where healthcare can be available, all of those I think are quite powerful. I think where I would say we need to go, and this is how I would characterize broadly kind of where we are in this work, and Raj and I have had this conversation as well. The next step is to figure out what it is precisely that is leading to the better outcomes for families so that we can have a more precise sense of where to invest. We can say, generally, moving to a higher opportunity neighborhood makes this difference. But we have all of these kind of enticing results over the years. One of the things that surprised us the most on MTO was these huge increases in physical and mental health for girls and particularly moms from MTO. But is that what is leading to the longer term improvements that Raj is seeing? What are the pathways to that, right? And I think the challenge for us is until we can actually say, no, investing in this program is going to make the difference, or changing this aspect of a neighborhood is going to make the difference, I think it's going to still be too hard for us to translate, the exciting results that we're seeing into very specific investments. And I think that that is really, in my mind, kind of the next frontier of this work, particularly on health, because it is the single biggest cost driver, and it's, we're seeing big change in that area, and so we have big opportunity to drive it in the right direction. That, to me, is what is going to allow us to really make the case as effectively as we can.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Shaun both for, in the middle of Director's Review, taking the time to be here. And for being such a champion of finding effective ways to make progress for millions of low-income people. Thank you, Shaun.